Before I call the Home Secretary to make her statement, I will remind the House that several hundred people have been charged with criminal offences relating to these disturbances. Most of these cases are still before the courts. Public order is a matter of national importance, and I am therefore granting a limited waiver to the House's sub judice resolution in the following terms. Members may make statements of fact about the circumstances of the unrest, about the number of people arrested, charged and sentenced, and about the kinds of behaviour exhibited during these events. However, they may not refer to specific individuals who have been charged and are awaiting trial, or engage in any discussion or speculation about individual cases. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I start, I want to pass our sympathies to the families of Sher Maximan and Musi Mnetu, who died sadly this weekend following violent incidents around Notting Hill Carnival. And our thoughts are with their friends and families at this terrible time, and our thanks go to the police who moved swiftly to charge suspects in both cases. There is no place for such appalling, senseless violence on our streets, and this government is determined to stamp out the scourge of serious violence wherever it is found. With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will now make a statement on the violent disorder that occurred earlier this summer. Just before the parliamentary recess, I made a statement to this House on the horrendous attack that took place in Southport on the 29th of July. 5 weeks on, our hearts still ache for the 3 precious little girls who lost their lives, for their loved ones, and for the other children who were injured or endured unspeakable horror that day. The House will know that a suspect has been charged and the investigation into the attack is ongoing. Those grieving families, the Southport community and the country will need answers, but for that reason the legal process must now take its course. That day in the House, all of us came together in sorrow and in solidarity with the families and with the people of Southport. And I spoke of the bravery, the compassion and the distress of the police, the paramedics and the firefighters that I had met that morning who were first on the scene. So it is truly appalling that within hours of that statement, those same Southport police were facing the most disgraceful, violent attacks from criminals and thugs. Police officers pelted with bricks and bottles, the local mosque, a place of worship, subjected to violent attack. And while millions of decent people across the country were praying for bereaved families, a criminal minority of thugs and extremists saw only an opportunity to hijack a town's grief. The Merseyside Chief Constable, Serena Kennedy, spoke at the funeral of Alice de Silva Aguiar, and she said she hoped that anyone taking part in the violent disorder was hanging their head in shame at the pain that they had caused the bereaved family. In the days that followed, we saw further disgraceful violent disorder in a number of towns and cities, repeated attacks on the very police officers whose job it is to keep communities safe, over 100 officers injured. In Sunderland, a citizens' advice branch set alight. In Liverpool, a library and vital community hub was torched. In Hull, shops were looted and a mosque was targeted. In Rotherham, a hotel used as asylum accommodation was set alight when people were inside. In Bolton, clashes between rival groups involved fireworks and bottles thrown. And we saw people targeted on the streets because of the colour of their skin. This disgraceful disorder and racist hatred, including that whipped up by a hateful minority online, was an insult to those grieving over Southport. So let us be very clear, those violent and criminal attacks were not protests, they were not about grievance, they were thuggery, racism and crime. Plenty of people across the country have strong views about crime, about policing, about immigration, asylum, the NHS and more, but they don't pick up bricks and throw them at the police. They don't loot shops or attack places of worship, And they don't set buildings alight knowing that other human beings are inside. There's lots to debate on all kinds of policy issues, but no one should make excuses for violence or thuggery that risks public safety. This was brazen criminality perpetrated in many cases by those with existing criminal convictions. The Prime Minister and I made clear that criminals would pay the price for their violence, and we meant it. The Prime Minister announced a new National Violent Disorder Programme to bring together the best policing capabilities and enhance intelligence sharing across forces. And ministers worked daily with the police and criminal justice partners to ensure that there was a strong and determined response. The National Police Coordination Centre operated a national mobilisation plan to ensure strategic reserves of public order officers were ready to be deployed in support of different police forces. Over 40,000 officer shifts were worked by public order officers over 10 days, with over 6,600 public order officers deployed on one day alone. Rest days were cancelled, additional hours were worked. The Crown Prosecution Service deployed over 100 additional prosecutors, boosting their 24-hour charging service with additional advice from the Director of Public Prosecutions so they could move swiftly to charge. The Ministry of Justice accelerated the work on new cells to bring 500 more prison places on stream earlier, and the Lord Chancellor made clear that the courts stood ready to hear all the cases coming through. And the Home Office established new rapid procedure for security support for mosques to ensure that communities felt supported and felt safe. In total, around 1,280 people have been arrested, around 800 charges have been made, and over 570 individuals have been brought before the courts for offences like violent disorder, assaults on emergency workers, arson, and for encouraging violent attacks online. This robust and swift response from government and the criminal justice system has provided a strong deterrent and showed our steadfast determination to keep people safe. And most importantly, order was restored. But I want now to just update the House on some of the next steps we will take. First, we will take forward positive policing reform to build on the important work done by the National Police Coordination Centre this summer. I want particularly to thank the Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council and Public Order Lead for the mobilisation work that they did. But the reality is that the coordination infrastructure and systems that they had to work with were too weak. And I'm therefore asking His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services to work quickly with the NPCC, the College of Policing and National Lead for Public Order to review the lessons from this summer's events so we can ensure strong coordination intelligence systems are in place and that there is sufficient public order policing for the future. Second, as well as ensuring there's proper punishment for those responsible for the disorder, we'll be pressing forward at pace with this government's mission to take back the safety of our streets and restore respect for the police and rule of law. We will put thousands more neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs back on the streets, reversing the collapse in community policing and rebuilding the relationship between local communities and forces. And this government is very clear. Wherever and whenever violence and disorder emerges, whether in Hartlepool or Hare Hills, Sunderland or Stoke, we expect crimes to face consequences and perpetrators to face the full force of the law. And the criminal violence we saw after the Southport attacks was not the only violent disorder this summer. We also saw disgraceful arson and attacks on the police in Hare Hills. In that case too, 32 people have been arrested, and in the last week, 3 men have pled guilty for arson and violent disorder after a bus was set alight. But third, I've been concerned for a long time not enough is being done to counter extremism, including both Islamist extremism and far-right extremism, as there's been no proper strategy in place since 2015. I have ordered a rapid review of extremism to ensure we have the strongest possible response to poisonous ideologies that corrode community cohesion and fray the fabric of our democracy. And alongside that, the Deputy Prime Minister is overseeing cross-government work to consider how we support our communities and address issues of cohesion in the longer term. Fourth, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology will strengthen the requirements for social media companies to take responsibility for the poison proliferated on their platforms with the rollout of the measures in the Online Safety Act, and we will continue to be clear that criminal content online results in criminal sanctions offline. And fifth, we stand ready to support the police Through the Special Grant for Policing and the Home Office will work with police and crime commissioners to ensure that the Riot Compensation Act works effectively in the areas that are affected. Madam Deputy Speaker, the country recoiled in horror at the scenes of violence and disorder in some cities and towns earlier in this summer. But let there be no doubt, the minority of criminal and thugs who sought to cause havoc do not represent Britain. Instead, across the country, we saw decent people coming together to support each other, to clean up the damage, to rebuild communities. The bricklayers who repaired the wall of the Southport Mosque, the residents who donated funds and books to restock the Spellow Library, the volunteers in Sunderland who found a new site to offer community advice, and there are so many more examples. And those small, unassuming acts of selflessness should serve as a message to the criminals and extremists that they do not speak for Britain and they never will. Yeah. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for an advanced copy of her statement. And I wish once again to pay my respects to the victims of the Southport attacks. The murder of 3 young girls in Southport was horrific, and our thoughts are with them, their families, their friends, and of course the local community. My thoughts are also with the families and friends of those who were killed at the Notting Hill Carnival. The Government and Mayor of London must do more to end the criminality and violence which too regularly mars this event, and they must bring forward credible plans to improve the safety of this well ahead of next year's carnivals. I pay tribute to the bravery of our police officers across the country who put themselves in harm's way to deal with the violence perpetrated by thugs this summer. There is not and can never be any excuse, justification or rationale for the violent disorder that we have seen. We cannot and will not let rioting thugs or extremists win. The government must always back our police officers to do what is necessary to maintain law and order, and attacks on the police by any group must not be tolerated. And intimidation of the public or the media cannot be allowed. So does the Home Secretary now see that the comments made by one of her own ministers at the time of the riots, seemingly making excuses for armed thugs intimidating the media, undermines the government's credibility, reinforces the accusations of bias, and puts people, including police officers, at increased risk? And does she now also recognise that the Labour leadership kneeling in the immediate aftermath of the Black Lives Matter disorder, when violent protesters attacked police officers, looks like her party takes some forms of violence less seriously than other forms of violence? And does she accept that any perception whatsoever of treating the same crimes differently based on the race, religion or community of the perpetrators increases tension rather than reduces it? And does she accept that at times of heightened tension, government ministers must be and must seem to be even-handed and demand even-handedness of others? Does she also recognise that the delay in holding a COBRA meeting until almost a week after these events started was a mistake? That it created a vacuum and delayed the actions which could have brought this disorder to an end more quickly? At the time of the disorder, the Prime Minister claimed he would create, and I quote, a standing army of public order police officers. What progress has been made in the intervening weeks to make that claim a reality? After the murder of the 3 young girls in Southport, the Right Honourable Lady and I discussed across the dispatch box the impact of misinformation and disinformation online. When I was Home Secretary, I travelled to the United States to deliver this message directly to the leadership of the tech firms and make
House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound.
Introduced by the Conservative government when I was on her side of the House, to ensure that the police are able to take firm action and clamp down on crime with all the force that the law allows, without the fear of being strung up for years in endless investigations. In government, we recruited 20,000 new police officers, but they will be hampered in their work if they do not feel supported by the government when they take the firm action needed to keep the people of this country safe. Violence has absolutely no place on our streets. Anyone who engages in violent disorder or commits violent crimes must face the full force of the law, no matter who they are. And we will continue to hold the government to account to ensure that they deal with disorder swiftly, effectively, fairly, and even-handedly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, look, I welcome, obviously, the Shadow Home Secretary's words of support for the Southport families and his reassertion that there can be no excuse for violent disorder. But I have to say the rest of his response sounded an awful lot more like a pitch to Tory party members in the middle of a leadership election than it did a serious response to the scale of the disorder that we saw and the need for a serious policing response. So he asked the issue around the strategic reserve. He asked about the standing army. We set up the strategic reserve. It was in place for the second weekend, and we had thousands of police officers who were ready, not the old arrangements that he used to, that we inherited from him, where mutual aid was had to be on call and had to be stood up in a rush when it was called for, but we actually got the police public order officers ready and deployed at strategic locations around the country so that they could move fast in order to be able to be there when they were needed. And this really goes to the heart of the problems that we inherited from the Home Secretary, the Shadow Home Secretary, and from my predecessor. The central coordination that he had left in place was far too weak. The officers, the chief officers who were involved in trying to get mutual aid in place, trying to coordinate intelligence, had very weak infrastructure, very weak systems in place. They hadn't been supported over very, very many years. In fact, some of his predecessors had tried to get rid of a lot of the work of the National Policing Coordination Centre. So our approach instead is to say that we should strengthen it. We believe that we should strengthen that coordination and we should strengthen the central coordination. We will work with the police to do so, and that is why I have asked the Inspectorate to operate. Secondly, he refers the issues around, seriously, I mean, on social media, the action against social media, his party delayed the Online Safety Act for years, year after year. My colleague, the Secretary of State for Science and Technology, has already been working closely to put more pressure onto the social media companies, but his party did nothing for years. It is far too late for them to try and call for action. The policing use of force review is important and will continue. But I have to say to him finally, this issue about he is playing all these games, undermining the credibility of the police, trying to blame the Prime Minister for something that happened 4 years ago. He's somehow responsible for the violent disorder on our streets this summer, and also undermining the credibility of police officers who take an oath. Each individual officer takes an oath to operate without fear or favour. And I would just remind him, his predecessor, the previous Home Secretary, was the one who first tried to undermine and attack the credibility of the police in the run-up to Armistice Day, and that is why we then ended up with a bunch of thugs trying to get to the cenotaph to disrupt the service and launching violent attacks on the police. That's the only reason he got the job of Home Secretary in the first place, because everyone condemned his predecessor for her behaviour. I'm so sorry that he's decided in a leadership election to follow her example rather than something that I really thought he was better than.
Andy Slaughter.
What a surprise. Can I compliment the Home Secretary and the Lord Chancellor on the robust response that the whole criminal justice system took to the recent riots and violent disorder. But was she, like me, concerned about the number of very young people who have been taking part, pre-teen in some cases? What does she think is the solution both to rehabilitation and preventing in the future young people of that age becoming involved in this disgraceful behaviour?
My honourable friend makes a really important point about the number of young people involved. Some of those who were involved had a string of convictions, a string of past history, but there were also young people who were drawn into violence and disorder, sometimes in antisocial behaviour and looting of shops, sometimes into serious violence as well. And I think there is an important issue about how we prevent young people getting drawn into violence and antisocial behaviour. It's one of the reasons we are so determined to set up the Young Futures programme. It's also one of the reasons that I think we need to look at online radicalisation of young people as well as part of the extremism review.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of the statement and associate myself and my party with her comments and her praise for the bravery and professionalism of the police and the other emergency services that we saw throughout these disgraceful episodes. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think this is a moment for everyone in this House to make it clear which side they are on. It simply is not credible to talk about two-tier policing and then in this next breath to say that you also support the police. The Home Secretary is correct to call out the disorder that we've seen for what it is. She says thuggery, racism and crime. So we support on these benches the steps that she has announced, but does she agree that actually this renders urgent the need to appoint an independent advisor on Islamophobia, a post that has been vacant for the last 2 years, and also to have a formal definition of Islamophobia in order to underpin and inform government policy across the board and across all departments?
And I welcome the Honourable Member's support for the police and the work that they did, and the importance of ensuring that these kinds of crimes are not tolerated and that they should face consequences. He's right that there were significant attacks on mosques, one of the reasons why we brought forward the work around mosque security, and he's also right that we do need to challenge Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hate, wherever it is found, and the Deputy Prime Minister is taking forward that work.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary rightly started her statement by remembering the victims of the horrific attack in my Southport constituency, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank her for that. It's one of the most appalling aspects of the disorder that we saw across the country last month, that we continually heard the claim from the thugs involved that they'd been driven to commit their acts of violence by the killing of little BB, Elsie Dot and Alice. That claim is a grotesque lie. And no one is more furious about that lie than the people of Southport, who wanted to just be allowed to deal with their grief and their anguish in their own way, and to support the families of those who'd been killed. It's no surprise to me that some of the targets of the violence were places of worship, Citizens Advice Bureau, a library. These are the places where communities go when they heal each other, when they are driven to improve each other and driven to improve themselves. And the thugs who attacked those targets set their face against that community self-improvement. So it's no surprise that they were the targets that they attacked. For those who continue to propagate the lie that there were justifiable concerns from the thuggery that we saw, or that the actions of the mob are somehow justified, I'd like to ask the Home Secretary to please reiterate that what happened in Southport provides no justification at all for anyone throwing bricks at the police, for anyone attacking people in their own cars or burning down buildings with people inside them, and that for anyone to pretend otherwise is too horrific for words.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his powerful words on behalf of his constituents, and also his work to stand up for his constituents and the people of Southport, and for those families who had to endure the most unspeakable horror and are still having to deal with the consequences of what happened. And his words for them and for his community about how no one should ever use the terrible attack on 3 little girls as being an excuse for the kinds of violent disorder that we have seen is absolutely right. I am so sorry that the families he represents and the community he represents has had to endure not just the original attack, but also people claiming to be doing things in the name of Southport when clearly they have not been doing, and it is simply crime.
Sir Julian Lewis.
The Home Secretary agree that one of the reasons why what might be called her shock and awe policy successfully shut down the violence so quickly was the speed with which the offenders were brought before the courts and sentenced. And if she does agree with that as a deterrent for the future, how can that model be adapted in other areas of justice?
I think the Honourable Member makes a really important point here, because there's no doubt that the swift response, the policing swift response, the prosecution swift response and the criminal justice system swift response clearly had a very strong impact and clearly was a deterrent and an overwhelming signal to people that if they get involved in disorder, they will pay the price. And he's right, really the implicit thing in his question is that there are long delays in the criminal justice system at the moment. We have seen long delays often in prosecutions. It's why it's one of the things that we are keen to work closely on in is the better cooperation between policing and the prosecution, CPS, in order to be able to remove some of the bureaucracy in place, in order to be able to speed up charges. But it's why we do recognise there has been a lot of damage to the criminal justice system. We do need to turn that round, because that is fundamental to respect for the rule of law.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just put on record what a powerful statement from the Honourable Member from Southport. There is no excuse to be racist or to use the innocent lives of Elsie, Alison and Bibi. Thank you, my honourable friend, for mentioning Chair Maximum and Musi Imnetu. And it is important in this House that we're all mindful about the language that we use and when we use it and how we use it, especially when we're referring to immigration and migration. And it is also important that we not only talk about thuggery, racism, but also Islamophobia. The rise in racism is frightening. And Love Music, Hate Racism are doing a lot of work around raging against hate. And I hope my right honourable friends will help and encourage them in that work. And will my honourable friend agree with me that we do need stronger regulations around social media companies?
Well, I welcome the points that my honourable friend has made. And I think one of the really most troubling things that we saw during those days of violence disorder was people feeling fearful to be out on the streets because of the colour of their skin. And that should never happen in our country. And that is why we do have to challenge racism, we do have to challenge extremism wherever it is found. My honourable friend, the Secretary of State, Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Science and Technology, is bringing forward the measures in the Online Safety Act, which will require social media companies to take action where there is criminal content. There has been considerable concern about criminal content remaining online, and we do need the social media companies to take responsibility for that.
Gavin Robinson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome to the Chair. Can I agree with the Home Secretary about her condemnation of violence, and indeed I suspect her unwillingness to open up this statement because she wants the voice of this House to be one of condemnation of violence. She is right about that, and she will know that the streets of Northern Ireland faced the same difficulties that England faced over the course of the summer. Almost 20 PSNI officers injured on our streets, and they benefited from the mutual aid support from Police Scotland during that time. She's not responsible for policing in Northern Ireland, but she is responsible for immigration policy throughout the United Kingdom. Can I ask her at some stage to indicate to this House and to the country what steps she will take to repair the damage of the last government through the Illegal Migration Act and the Safety of Rwanda Act, which specifically for the first time now do not apply in Northern Ireland following court judgment because of the Windsor Framework? We no longer have a uniform immigration policy in this country. And can I ask her as Home Secretary what steps she will take to address that?
Can I first join the Honourable Member in condemning the appalling violent disorder that we saw on the streets of Belfast, and the disorder that we saw in Northern Ireland, and also to welcome the support from Police Scotland and the mutual aid that took place. He raises important issues about immigration policy. I'm very happy to debate those, also to talk to him directly further about this. It's important. There are a whole series of areas where reforms are going to be needed, and there's an important debate to take place around border security, around the asylum system, around the way immigration rules operate, and so on, where there are reforms that this government wants to bring forward. I simply think that it is really important that no one excuses the kind of violent disorder we saw as being somehow related to issues about policy, where lots of people have really strong views about immigration policy. They don't pick up bricks and throw them at the police.
Jonathan Brash.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the violence that took place in my constituency of Hartlepool on the 31st of July was perpetrated by a minority of violent thugs, and I would like to place on record my thanks to the police, some of whom ended up in hospital that evening as a result of them defending their town and the people who live there. It's undoubtedly the case that the violence that we saw was fuelled by the lies and misinformation that are largely, although not exclusively, perpetrated online. What can you do, Home Secretary, to challenge and prevent the spread of this misinformation, and to clear the way to allow us to have the debate, the wider debate about asylum and immigration that decent, hard-working people want to have, free from these lies?
Well, my honourable friend is right that there has been continual misinformation and often deliberate misinformation as well. I would also say, though, that I think those who made the decision to choose to get involved in violent disorder, attacks on the police, attacks on shops, the looting, the disgraceful attacks, they have to take responsibility for their own actions. They cannot blame things that they saw online for that. They have to take responsibility for their own actions. But equally, we have also been made clear that what is criminal offline is also criminal online, and there is important responsibility on those posting online, but also the social media companies to make sure that criminal content is taken down. He's also right, we should be able to have a serious debate about issues around immigration, about issues around asylum, about issues around the stronger border controls, for example, that this government wants to see and to bring in. But I do think that is separate from the kind of violent disorder that we saw, and nobody should use policy issues around crime and policing, around any issue, as being any kind of excuse for violence on our streets.
Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What percentage of these cases were dealt with by district judges rather than the lay magistrate, and where was that change made within the CPS, and will those changes be applied to new disorders, for example, committed by Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, and will they be applied to the Manchester Airport incident?
So the Honourable Member will know that the charging decisions and also which courts take the decisions is obviously not a matter for government, rightly so. These are independent matters, both for the CPS and for the courts and for the judicial system. I'm happy to write to her with detailed information about the numbers of cases that have been dealt with in the different courts, as I don't have that information to hand.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Home Secretary for her statement and echo her acknowledgement for the remarkable courage and dedication of the police. Last month, officers across the country and in my constituency of Blackpool South faced significant challenges as they bravely stood against a barrage of projectiles, working diligently to protect our local mosque, hotels and town centres from hateful extremists seeking to disrupt our communities. Lancashire Police were outstanding. They stood tall and resolute in the face of adversity, just like I'd seen countless times when I was serving as Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner. So will the Home Secretary join me in thanking all those police across our country, and especially in Lancashire, and acknowledge that we are fortunate to have such a dedicated, brave and professional group of officers who are at the front line battling crime and disorder?
And I welcome the points that my honourable friend has made, and just put on record my strong gratitude towards police officers across the country and my tribute to them. Officers who gave up their rest days, who worked additional overtime, who were particularly stretched during that period in August to make sure that they had enough public order trained police on the streets. They did a remarkable job, and all of us should show them our gratitude and our support.
Pete Wishart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I think first of all we in Scotland are grateful that we were spared any of the violence that we saw throughout the rest of the United Kingdom. But where she says she wants a debate, does she accept that the way that immigrants and asylum seekers are being portrayed by a whole host of political voices has helped to foster and ferment and even encourage some of the scenes that we witnessed? And those that have been whipping up this type of activity must be held to account, as are those that peddled the misinformation. And will she also help that debate by talking a little bit more positively about immigration, stop demonising asylum seekers, and will she try and encourage that we do have that debate, but it's a better debate?
Well, I certainly think we should have sort of honest and practical debates about issues rather than debates that end up being lost in rhetoric and often losing sight of the facts and practical issues as well. I do also think that some of what we saw was we have seen extremism as well as local criminals and thugs. Sometimes it was people who had a violent history of crime in the local area who also got involved in this. And so I think in terms of dealing with the disorder, we have to deal with all the different aspects and all the different origins of it as well.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for the strong leadership that the Home Secretary has shown on this, and the truth is these events did not happen in a vacuum. That's why after 3 days of distress and panic in Walthamstow, because somebody published a list suggesting that thugs were going to come to our community, thousands of people took to our streets. They stood with members of our local mosques and churches, holding hands with them to keep them safe. They helped businesses board up their properties. We even had knitters against Nazis. But the truth is, we know in Walthamstow, which is we're grateful for that solidarity, that the fear endures even after the immediate threat has gone. And that is the challenge that we have to deal with in this place. Those people who promote anger rather than answers to the challenges that we face in our society. The Home Secretary has talked about a review. Can she set out for us actually what she means by far-right extremism and what we will mean by these terms? Because those details matter in being able to have these debates and give confidence to those communities that are targeted that we stand with them, as we did in Walthamstow that day, and we will do every day.
I thank my honourable friend for her question. Look, nobody in Britain should ever feel afraid because of the colour of their skin. And that is the really troubling thing that we found people saying and feeling as a result of the violent disorder that we saw earlier in the summer. I have set up a review around countering extremism. I have had concerns for a long time that not enough is being done to counter extremism in this country, and that means both the far-right extremism and also Islamist extremism and some of the other forms of changing extremism that don't fit necessarily into the same clear, more historic categories. There's been a definition that the Home Office has used for a long time around extreme right-wing extremism and some of the issues online, but we also know there are changing patterns, particularly with online radicalisation that are taking place. And that's why I think this review is so important. The last countering extremism strategy was set out in 2015. So much has changed since then, especially around online radicalisation, but we need to tackle all forms of extremism and violent hatred because it's too important to our well-being as a democracy and who we are as a country. We have always stood against that kind of extremism. We must continue to do so.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the amount of stabbings and deaths by stabbings in this country is reaching shocking levels. Now, we've seen the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister over the past few weeks have fast-tracked these violent criminals on these riots, got them in the courts and in prison within 2 weeks. Isn't it about time we did the same with these yobbos, these thugs that are carrying knives?
Well, I said to the honourable member, I welcome his support for the speedy response from the police and criminal justice system to the violence that we've seen on our streets. And I agree with him that I think it is a serious problem that we have inherited such huge long delays in the criminal justice system and the ability to get cases very swiftly to court. That is particularly the issues around knife crime, which again, knife crime has substantially increased in recent years, and it is why the newly elected Labour government has made halving knife crime part of our mission for safer streets across this country. We want to see stronger action against young people who are caught and get drawn into knife crime. We want to see a stronger Young Futures prevention programme, and we want to see stronger action against the online companies who continue to make it far too easy to get hold of knives. We have to have stronger action across the board to speed up the processes and make sure that there are consequences for knife crime.
Nadia Whittam.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the appalling racist riots may be over for now, but the ideology behind them is a growing threat, both here and internationally. In Germany, for example, the far right has just won a state election for the first time since the Second World War. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that to prevent more people being won over by the far right, our government must deliver proper improvements in living standards to combat disillusionment and refuse to march to the beat of their drum on immigration and Islamophobia?
I was just respond to the points that the honourable member has made, honourable friend has made. Clearly, we want to see increasing living standards right across the board. That is immensely important. We also need to have a serious and sensible debate around a range of policies, including around crime, including around immigration and the issues that the Home Office is responsible for. I think, but the other issue that I would say is I think that the kinds of online radicalisation that we have seen, be that into both far-right extremism and also into Islamist extremism, we have to have much stronger action against to counter that online radicalisation. That's why we are setting up this new review around countering extremism. And we also have to make sure that people take responsibility for those who are committing the crimes, who are committing the disorder and violent crimes, have to take responsibility for that, because there is no excuse, be it around any policy issue or living standards or any issue, can never stand as an excuse for that kind of violence, the sorts of racist attacks and the kind of disorder that we saw.
Sian Berry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ugly racist mob violence we saw in our towns and cities this summer was incited and organised by far-right groups, often using electronic platforms including Telegram and X. For example, on Telegram, we know that groups have distributed instructions for making petrol bombs, and locations of hotels housing migrants and offices of immigration lawyers were also shared. We also know that Elon Musk, the proprietor of X, has greatly amplified some accounts that promote racist violence in our cities, while failing to take action to remove others. As part of her response, will the Home Secretary therefore be looking at options for prosecuting those who own platforms that may have enabled or committed crimes under Section 2 of the Terrorism Act 2006?
Well, the honourable member will be aware that the Online Safety Act has been long delayed, but it does still need to be fully implemented. And one of the issues around the Online Safety Act includes the responsibility on the social media companies to remove illegal content. And many of the things that she was raising are illegal content that is still available online, and it is shocking and irresponsible that some of that material is still available online. That is why we need the speedy implementation of the Online Safety Act, and particularly starting with those measures around the criminal content and the requirements to remove it. But I think there's actually a much broader responsibility on these social media companies as well for some of they're ignoring their own terms and conditions, ignoring their responsibility towards communities and towards public safety, and they need to take that more seriously too.
Can I encourage members to have short questions, and the Home Secretary please to make answers shorter, as I'd like to get everyone in. Joe White.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Home Secretary for her statement. She has made the point, and I agree with her, that it is perfectly possible to have a debate in our country about immigration and many other issues without resorting to looting shops, attacking minority groups and throwing bricks at police. In my constituency, I regularly have conversations with local people who feel that net migration is too high, who worry about the cost of asylum hotels and about the number of people entering our country illegally. And in electing me, they have an MP who is prepared to raise these issues in Parliament and work with the government to address them. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that this is how this democratic country should operate like ours, rather than a bunch of hooligans using it as an excuse to smash up shops, burn cars and attack the police?
My honourable friend is exactly right. There is an important debate that we can have in this place and amongst all of us, and it's this kind of debate that people do have in communities across the country about issues that she raises around net migration, around issues around border control. All of those, most of us across the country talk about and work out what the action is needed and the policies that are needed, but that is no excuse for taking the kind of violent action that we have seen, attacking police officers whose very job it is to keep us safe.
Gregory Campbell.
Deputy Speaker, would the Home Secretary agree with me that at the start of the trouble in Northern Ireland, I went to our Deputy First Minister and got her, with the help of the local health trust, to visit our local hospital, where we were able to offer some form of reassurance to people of whatever background in every country of origin that they came from, that they had our total support. Would you agree that that is a good, positive way to approach this, but also that we identify and speak about some of the issues that many people have about illegal immigration, and try to ensure that we don't see in this country what we have seen in other countries across the EU?
Well, the honourable member is right that the thing that we have always done in this country is people have come together, people have worked together, people work together on issues, on tackling problems, on debating issues. The people who were responsible for this kind of violence and these attacks, including on our police officers, do not speak for the United Kingdom. They really don't. They don't speak for any part of the UK, and we should never let them do so.
Absana Begum.
Deputy Speaker, for too long, Muslims have been scapegoated for the failings of the political and economic system by the same type of politics which led to the hostile environment for migrants. Could the Home Secretary outline what steps she will take to ensure that any measures that arise from the rapid review of extremism do not perpetuate or extend harm to the very communities, Muslims and migrants, who have been the primary target of the far right's violence?
Well, the honourable member makes an important point. The whole purpose of having a review around countering extremism is to make sure that we are tackling the kinds of extremism that we have seen grow in this country in recent years, and that includes the far-right extremism, it also includes the Islamist extremism, it includes the kinds of Islamophobia that we have seen, and the violent Islamophobia and attacks that we have seen, as well as concerns around anti-Semitic attacks as well. We have to make sure that we do so, and we work with communities, and that is immensely important, that we work with communities who are often the most affected by extremism and by the damage that it can do.
Jim Alistair.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join in the condemnation of the thuggery and violence that we all saw and deplored. But could I take the Home Secretary back to the point alluded to by the Honourable Member for East Belfast? Is she comfortable with the fact that under the Windsor framework, any immigration policy that she devises must pass through the filter of EU law and is subject to the requirements of EU law? How could a Home Secretary implement a national policy so long as that prevails? And will she act with this government in setting aside that which they inherited from the Tory government, that imposition of the loss of sovereignty over immigration and so many other matters as far as Northern Ireland is concerned?
Well, I would say to the honourable members, there will be many opportunities in this House to talk about the details of immigration policy, and I will certainly do that and to discuss those issues further with him, be it around the border security, be it around wider issues on immigration policy. Very happy to do so. This statement obviously was about the violent disorder that we saw this summer and how we ensure that cannot be repeated, how we make sure that we have the reforms in place to address that.
Andrew Peggs.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the strong leadership this Government and the Home Secretary has taken. Even though Peterborough avoided the right-wing thuggery that many places saw earlier this summer, despite the best efforts of online misinformation and rumours, the events of the summer cast a long shadow onto communities and constituencies like mine. And I'd really like to put on record my thanks to Peterborough's Joint Mosque Council, Community First, Peterborough Community User Group, Unity Group, as well as the police and council officers who worked around the clock to keep businesses and communities safe. Can the Home Secretary give confidence and comfort to communities like mine that we will continue to tackle in the weeks and months ahead extremism and Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, which isn't just about this summer, has been rising over the recent years and is part of the source we need to tackle in this issue?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and it's why the Deputy Prime Minister is taking forward work around community cohesion and also just recognising that really right across the country, the overwhelming majority of people were truly appalled by what we saw from a small minority of people. The action that we took was important because it meant that that small minority who were involved in disorder faced the consequences for doing so. Nevertheless, they do not speak for Britain, and they certainly don't speak for his community.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Home Secretary very much for her statement and the Right Honourable Lady's clear, strong leadership and indeed swift action. Well done, Home Secretary. I think it's one that each one of us as MPs and across this great nation wish to see. In Northern Ireland, we have remained untouched with the unrest that has been seen on the mainland, but in Newton Ards in particular, if I can just say this, sometimes, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's easy to focus upon the negatives, but the positives are there as well, where people come together as one, all the religions, all the political persuasions come to one, and they stand together against what happens. I think they have to take some encouragement for that. But in regard to community tensions, in my estimation, what is essential is that every everyday person who has legitimate concerns with illegal immigration are not drawn into situations which become less about the right to display disapproval and protest, but more about violence. Home Secretary, how will government seek to ensure that those with legitimate concerns are heard, and that those whose intent is simply to disrupt and destroy are dealt with very appropriately? Thank you.
Well, welcome the honourable member's points that he makes on this and his recognition of the seriousness of and the damage done by the violent disorder. He's also right that there is an important debate that most people in the country want to have a serious debate about, about the importance that net migration needs to come down. We have been clear our view on that, why we also need stronger border security in place, and we also need to recognise, I think most people across the country want to see both stronger border controls and also the UK to continue to be a country that does its bit to help those who have fled persecution and conflict, but also where the rules are properly respected and enforced, and those who don't have a right to be in the UK are properly returned. So there are a whole series of proper issues that we should debate around immigration. I think most people want to be part of, but I also think the overwhelming majority of people don't want to go anywhere near this kind of violence and thuggery, because that's not the kind of country we are. That is not the kind of values that most people in this country have. Most of us, as he says, want to come together to support each other and to have serious debates, not engage in attacks on police officers and attacks on communities.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by sending my condolences to the family, friends and loved ones of those 3 little girls murdered in Southport. Liverpool has a very proud history of fighting right-wing terrorism on the streets of our city. However, the diverse communities of my Liverpool Riverside constituency, particularly those who are visibly black and Muslim, are still very anxious about going out due to the rise in racism and Islamophobia. My honourable friend has mentioned how the Deputy Prime Minister is doing some work around community cohesion, but I would be very grateful if you confirm whether local authorities like mine will receive additional funding to undertake this work.
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister will be working with local councils across the country around what we need to do to improve cohesion. The Deputy Prime Minister and I have discussed this, the importance of these issues many times, and having the work alongside each other, where the Home Office will lead the work around countering extremism, and the Deputy Prime Minister's Office, the MCHLG, leads the work around strengthening community cohesion with local councils, because my honourable friend is exactly right. You cannot have a situation where people feel afraid or at risk on the streets of this country because of the colour of the skin or because of their religion as well. And that's why it's so important that we have the 2 programmes of work in parallel around cohesion and around extremism.
Colin Naismith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that those who suggest that we have some form of 2-tier policing in this country only serve to undermine our brave frontline police officers who put themselves at risk every single day to maintain order, and that anybody who does so does it not in our country's name or traditions?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point here, because police officers in this country take an oath when they become officers to operate without fear or favour, and they work immensely hard to uphold that, and they do so right across the country. We rightly have operational independence for policing as well, and we have seen these claims used by those who somehow want to legitimise attacks on the police, the very police who are working so hard to keep us safe. It is wrong to do so. We should be supporting the police. We should be working with the police to raise standards across policing and working with the police to make sure that they can continue to do their work to keep our communities safe.
Jake Richards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the scenes outside a hotel in Wath over the summer took place just a few miles away from my constituency. A group of rioters attended a hotel, set it on fire, knowing full well there were innocent people inside, including a constituent of mine who was being housed there with her children by the local authority under their statutory responsibilities as she had recently been made homeless. Local police officers worked 20-hour shifts to keep her safe. And the next day after the riots, local people attended to clear up the rubble. And in the weeks after, community groups like the Dinnington Boxing Community Group organised events to show unity and solidarity in the face of violence. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that that is the true spirit of South Yorkshire and not the act of those mindless thugs who attacked the hotel in Wath?
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point and speaks very powerfully for his constituency. I'm so sorry that his constituent was affected in this way by the violence. And he is right to talk about the true spirit of South Yorkshire and communities that come together right across our coalfield communities. There is a spirit of solidarity of people coming together and really strong communities who pull together and who will not stand for this sort of violence or thuggery.
Lewis Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents in Sunderland Central were appalled by the criminal disorder we saw on our streets at the start of August, and which are in no way representative of our city. The contrast between thugs who prefer destruction with the decent law-abiding majority was clearly shown by the response of our community. Whether that be Northumbria police officers standing up and protecting our communities in the face of attacks, the hundreds of residents of every race and religion turning up the day after, not just to sweep away the shards of glass, but also the shards of hatred that had been sown the night before. Or whether that be the Sunderland CAB, who refused to let the arson attack stop them providing services. So will she join me in praising the response of the people of Sunderland and similar communities across the country? And does she agree it is their example we should be building upon as we look to strengthen community cohesion in the future?
My honourable friend is exactly right, and he speaks strongly for the people of Sunderland who came together, the volunteers who made sure the Citizens' Advice could still keep working and could provide support for local people who were vulnerable and who needed advice and help. They made sure that that would continue. They have worked with the police, with local communities, and they are the people who speak not just for Sunderland, but the whole of Britain.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement today and for the swift action during the violent disorder to provide a reassurance to mosques and the Muslim communities that this blatant Islamophobia will not be tolerated. The Home Secretary announced rapid access to the Protective Security for Mosques funding scheme, which was welcomed by mosques across the UK to help them to provide additional security when needed. Can the Home Secretary confirm how many have now accessed this funding and what proactive engagement the Home Office is doing with the mosques and the Muslim organisation to support them in their funding applications?
My honourable friend makes an important point about the procedure we brought in, the emergency procedure, to be able to accelerate support for mosques, security provisions to put in place for mosques, because frankly everybody has the right to feel safe at their place of worship and to be able to do so without fear of attack. I will send him the further details of the update on the precise numbers. Dozens of mosques came forward and were provided with swift support to make sure that they had that security in place under the accelerated procedure. It's really important that Muslim communities can feel safe.
Jessica Toll.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for the Home Secretary's statement and welcome the range of police reforms she has outlined. I want to put on record my thanks to Dorset Police for their rapid and proactive work with local residents, community groups, mosques, protesters and counter-protesters to prevent two organised protests in Bournemouth Town Centre from descending into the type of violent disorder that we saw in other parts of the country. It will take time to roll out some of these police reforms, which I hope will include the funding formula, which currently doesn't recognise the seasonal challenges we face every year in Bournemouth. But does she agree with me that we are lucky to have such dedicated and professional police forces on the front lines, preventing crime and disorder with the limited resources that they do have?
One friend makes a point really about the tradition of British policing, which I think is one we should feel proud of in this country. It stretches back to Peel, that the police do operate without fear and favour, but that they are operationally independent, and that the tradition is that the police are the public are the police. We have a tradition of policing by consent. It's why the drop in confidence in policing in recent years is a real challenge, and it's why this government is determined to turn that around and to work with the police to rebuild confidence in policing, and it's why we'll continue to support police, including with more neighbourhood policing as well, because I think we should feel very proud of the British policing model and support it.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for her statement. She'll be aware that the riots which sought to exploit the Southport killings for a racist and Islamophobic agenda included one in Middlesbrough which saw homes, businesses and vehicles damaged in a predominantly Asian and Muslim area, where thugs created roadblocks that only allow white British drivers to pass. This racist violence caused real fear, resulting in the postponement of the Middlesbrough Mailer, the premier celebration of multiculturalism in the North East. But now the community, which so magnificently cleaned up the mess, refuses to be cowed, so the Mailer has a new date and will go ahead this coming weekend. So will the Home Secretary join me in welcoming the restoration of the Middlesbrough Mailer and all Mailer events held across the country as important demonstrations of our working class communities enjoying and celebrating our diversity?
Well, I'm very glad to hear my honourable friend's description of the way in which communities come together to celebrate, and it's really distressing to hear the fear that was created and to have community events delayed in that way because of that fear. Can I also thank him because he has been a continued champion of his constituents throughout some of the violent disorder that we saw in Middlesbrough, and he and I have spoken about the things that happened, and I want to thank him for standing up for his constituents.
Tony Reid.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there's been much discussion about the role that social media played in fueling the violent disorder that we've seen on our streets, and many of the extremists were swiftly arrested and charged. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those who spread pernicious and poisonous online lies should also share the responsibility for the disorder that we have seen? And does the Home Secretary agree with me that online thugs who deliberately stir up hatred and division should have been similarly punished? If not, what does the Home Secretary think can be done about this increasingly wicked online behaviour?
Well, my honourable friend is right. We've seen deliberate attempts to radicalise people or to promote extremism online, including on social media companies. We've seen content that is illegal not taken down. And we've also had, obviously, look, the incitement and encouraging serious violence and racial hatred has been a criminal offence offline in this country for very many years. But what is criminal offline is also criminal online, and people need to take responsibility for the crimes that they commit, and it's why we have taken this so seriously and why we're so clear the Online Safety Act needs to be implemented to make sure that the social media companies take some responsibility for criminal content online.
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last month, Elon Musk fanned the flames of violent disorder. He personally amplified extremist accounts and even shamefully said that he believed our country was heading for civil war. 10 months previously, the leader of the Conservative Party invited Elon Musk to Downing Street, and in a stunt they even superimposed his new logo onto the front of Downing Street. Does my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, agree with me that there was a major error of judgment by the party opposite, and that Elon Musk has no interest in our democracy, only himself?
Well, I think there's an important point here, which is that the social media companies and their owners need to take some responsibility for the sort of criminal content that appears on their platforms, but also in the way that they operate, the way that their algorithms operate, the way that they can be used and manipulated by extremists as well. As for misjudgments by the party opposite, I think there are too many to list now.
And I thank the Home Secretary for that statement, and we're now just going to allow a few moments so the front benches can swap over.